we live? Okay, great. Sorry for the delay. We're having a few interesting technical difficulties. I'm Professor Tim Olsen from the Union College Jazz Ensemble, Professor of Music, and very excited to be presenting the first of our Monday Jazz live stream performances from the beautiful First Reformed Church Covenant Hall. I'd like to thank our engineer Nathan Scheid for making this happen. Also Reverend Bill Levering, pastor at First Reformed. They have a dedicated live stream and they broadcast their Sunday worship. They broadcast Jazz Vespers, where I play every now and then. And so I did a little arm twisting, and I'm very happy to be presenting this series every other Monday. If you're here right now, then you figured it out. Come back in 2 weeks, and you will see Michael Benedict on vibes, Pete Twigo on bass, Pete Sweeney on drums, myself. And then 2 weeks after that, I'll be doing a solo program about the great pianists. And then 2 weeks after that, November 9th, I have something called Anything Goes, and I'm actually not quite sure what it's going to be. Please tune in at firstreformed.com to check it out. But today, we're examining the great songwriters, and originally this was a 19-hour concert. I started putting songs together and could probably play, with Burger King breaks in between, could probably play for 19 hours. There's such great repertoire to get into in thinking about the so-called Great American Songbook, that body of works from the early 1900s up until the dawn of rock and roll. Still a few things kind of trickling after that. But we're looking at songwriters writing for the musical stage, for film, for TV, writing individual songs. And also we'll be examining a few of the great instrumental jazz composers, a few of their pieces. And so I've got this huge list here. I'm going to grind my way through. I think I'm going to say a few technical things first. My class, my History of Jazz class, is watching, so if you have any questions, you can maybe send something to the comments and Nathan will relay them to me in the next hour. But most of these songs are in the verse-chorus tradition. The most interesting content, I think, is in the chorus or the refrain, where the sort of the overall theme or overall emotion of the story is set. The verses typically tell the actual events in the circumstances. And coming out of late 1800s, people like Charles Harris with his phenomenal After the Ball, and Jerome Kern, some other early songwriters, Harry von Tilser, writing these waltz pieces, they often have lots and lots and lots of verses. And they tell these long, elaborate stories of love that's somehow gotten screwed up, or people who are lost, because, of course, this idea of nostalgia is super important. And people, you think, oh, let's get together. Okay, great. Well, you're dead. Well, gee, that's the problem. Or you're in Ohio and I'm in California at the gold rush or something like that. So lots of songs about longing, about being apart, about unrequited love, etc., etc. Things often don't turn out right, which makes for great drama and great storytelling in the form of a song. After a while, this idea of having tons and tons and tons of verses got kind of tedious, and so songs came to be kind of whittled down, where maybe they only had 2 verses and then the chorus. So it'd be intro, verse, chorus, verse, chorus. And typically the chorus would be more important. And if you ask someone, oh, could you sing that song for me? Could you whistle that famous song, from 1896 or something? They would sing the chorus or the refrain, because that's the part that had sort of the most musical magic, if that made sense. And the whole point of the verse is to start from ground zero and lead us up to the beautiful magic of the refrain. And the refrain, sometimes the first couple of words of the refrain are the name of the song or something like that. Let's see. I think I'm going to start out with an early piece. Irving Berlin is one of the most important early songwriters, born in Russia, immigrated to the United States with lots of other Jewish folk from Eastern Europe, Russia, etc., facing immense persecution, came to New York City, where there was just a very large Jewish population, immigrants, and they formed this sort of very bubbling community lots of people involved in theater, in music, in writing, in all kinds of different artistic expression. And Irving Berlin is sort of one of the most important success stories, starting off from nothing, working his way up as a writer, working for publishing houses and realizing he should have his own publishing house, which he did for like 6 decades or something like that. He only lived to be 100 or something. And so he made his way through all kinds of important eras in American popular music. But one of his early pieces is called Alexander's Ragtime Band. The most important thing to know about Alexander's Ragtime Band is it's not ragtime. It's a pop song. It has some kind of jaunty rhythms to it, and it includes the word ragtime like 16 times or something, and it's got kind of marchy things happening in the left hand, but it's more or less a pop song. It has a verse that lots of people don't know. They only know, come on and hear Alexander's Ragtime Band, right? If you ask somebody to start singing Alexander's Ragtime Band, and they're not going to go, oh my honey, unless they're a musical theater person or something. But I'm going to give you the verse, I'm going to give you the chorus, maybe solo a little bit. So here comes a little bit of Alexander's Ragtime Band. So it's a pretty jaunty piece, very bouncy, very marchy in the left hand. And Berlin was great at writing in kind of a variety of styles, although having studied a number of his pieces over the years, you can sort of put them in a certain bin, kind of a patriotic, jaunty, post-George M. Cohen kind of a piece. Sometimes you've got romantic ballads, sometimes you have sort of ethnic pieces, whether it's Irish or German or Yiddish or something like that. Now we're going to take a look at another piece by Berlin. This is called Always, a waltz, kind of a slower ballad he wrote for his wife, and he gave her all of the royalties from this song kind of as a wedding present in the mid-20s. Talking about our song forms that we've discussed in class, and for those of you who aren't in the class, don't panic, we're going to go there right now. We have a couple important 32-bar song forms. The first one is A-A-B-A, where you have an 8-bar section. It's repeated again. Then you get 8 bars of something different. Then you finish with the original 8 bars. A-B-A-C is kind of like the first half and the second half start out the same, but they end a little bit differently. And that's what we're going to get with Always. And here's a little intro. So that song followed the A, B, A, C because both the first half and the second half start off. The first time through it goes, whereas the second time through it goes. So one of the most interesting aspects, I think, of popular music and this concept has sort of bedeviled songwriters and all kinds of people at all ends of the music business spectrum, from those interested most in the music to those most interested in the business or making money off of composers, performers, songwriters, lyricists, etc., through live performances, through all the various media that have occurred and shown up over the last 150 years, all the way from piano rolls and sheet music through 78 records, to radio broadcasts, to 8-track cassettes, 8-track tapes, if you know what those are, to cassettes, to CDs, to MP3s, to, I'm not quite sure, sticking a USB cable in your head or something is where we're going next. I have no idea. But people at the end of the spectrum wanting to monetize, that's probably a 2020 word, monetize aspects of this intellectual property. And to make this a very, very long sentence, what has bedeviled them is, how do you write a great pop song? And I think it's an amazing recipe, and there are lots and lots of right answers, and unfortunately there are lots and lots of wrong answers. And you all know the wrong answers because those are the songs you hear on the radio, or you play them somewhere and you're like, oh my God, this is just the worst song I've ever heard, and you never play it again. And you could figure out and say, well, gee, why is it so horrible? Oh, it could be that it's really repetitive, or maybe it's not repetitive enough. There's a magic balance where you take a basic kernel of an idea and you manipulate it and you work it around and you take it places. So if we could take always, and then you have the word always, and then that same motive, always, then we get to the B section. We modulate to a different key. Always, always. And so we go to this distant key. If you're keeping score, it's 3. And 3 takes us back to 5, which makes us want to go back to 1. So that same little pattern is kind of twisted around. I'll be loving you always. So we have a couple little pieces that make up the song Always. Ba-da-da-da-da is one of those little ingredients. The other ingredient is always, always, that little downward moving way of expressing the word always. And so I think Berlin had a great knack, as did lots of the folks I'll be mentioning this hour, of taking ordinary English and really capturing how it feels to sing it and making it unpretentious, even though it could have really complex things happening in it, so that your audience, your general public, wants to sing it, wants to buy it, wants to hear it, etc., etc. Before we had radio, we had song pluggers who were sort of the minions or agents of the publishing houses, and they basically buttonholed or hustled musical people, singers, the people who worked in showbiz, and would say, hey, it's a great song, I'll sing it for you. And here's a copy, take this copy. They'd walk around New York with lots of sheet music under their arm. And sometimes they would, if you were a not very famous person, you'd have to pay money for the privilege of singing a song. However, if you were famous, sometimes little envelopes of cash would flow towards you, and you would try to interpolate or include a particular song in a particular performance. I read in my research for this class about how some song pluggers would go buy up a bunch of tickets to a show, like a vaudeville show. This is kind of pre-Broadway, so maybe it's 1910s or something like that. And they'd sit 20 people together, and at some point in the intermission or whenever, they would just start singing the pre-approved song out of random. It's sort of like a flash mob of 110 years ago. The whole point being to get an audience in the auditorium and the performers on stage and in the pit to get them interested in performing this music to generate income. And again, as we said with Irving Berlin, also Charles Harris, who wrote this piece after the ball, they first started out with other publishers, but then they realized they could make so much more money publishing themselves. And so they opened up their own publishing houses and figured out the best way to kind of get their stock going, and they picked what they thought were the best songs by themselves and by their colleagues and friends, and that's how this industry really took off. Let's see, what am I going to be looking at here? And as talking film or sound film became important in the 1920s, composers and lyricists opened up their vistas and their horizons towards music for film as well. And here's one of the most famous ones from 1939. This is Harold Arlen's Over the Rainbow, which, sung by Judy Garland in The Wizard of Oz, really became one of the most beloved songs, I think, of the pop song repertoire. So if I were in a live environment, I would say, okay, class, tell me what the form is of this piece. Nathan, do you know the form of this piece? I think it's AABA, where the A section has this very dramatic rising up of the octave, and then it moves its way down. Right, so again, we have the basic building block of the song, Somewhere. I know a little while later, Leonard Bernstein did his Somewhere There's a Place, right, which I think might pay homage to this piece, but also makes you think about the word somewhere and how you can set it to music. But da 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 da. So it has a rising interval of different length, and the sort of size of the interval helps determine the dramatic quality of the particular phrase. So that's the A section. The B section has the kind of a nice contrast where instead of these dramatic leaps, you've got this kind of static that reminds you of, I know in theory class we talk about what is this minor third. It reminds you of, police cars in Paris or something, or in the Minion movies, that kind of a sound. But you've got that static quality as compared to the large leaping quality of the A section. And then to end it, it goes to the B section just as a little bit of a contrast. Let's see. I'm going to talk about some instrumental music. Glenn Miller, of course, led a famous big band in the 30s and 40s until he disappeared in the World War II in a plane over somewhere in the waters surrounding Great Britain. But he wrote this piece called Moonlight Serenade, and if I can find it, I'm going to play it for you. This was a classic instrumental, and again, reading up on this, you can go to jazzstandards.com, and there's so much trivia and whatever that you'll never appear for days after looking up the most beloved 5,000 songs or something like that. But Moonlight Serenade started out life as an instrumental. It later got lyrics from a guy named Mitchell Parrish, who we're going to see in a little while, because it turns out the songs I really wanted to talk about, he wrote words to a number of them. But an author describes, or it's sort of a jazz critic describes Moonlight Serenade as this sort of, the ultimate slow dance, this jazz romantic ballad kind of a piece that you would hear, at the Army canteen, or you'd hear on the radio at 11 o'clock at night on a live broadcast or something like that. And just a very nice ballad kind of a piece. And the commentator goes on to talk about how even though Glenn Miller wasn't a very warm or humane or nice person on stage or off stage, it's ironic that he put this piece together and it has sort of become the ultimate, swooning kind of a piece. So imagine a big band with clarinets and whatnot playing this. One thought about the particular sound of the Miller Orchestra is that they were missing a trumpet, and so they replaced one of the voices with a clarinet. And it creates that kind of lighter and brighter sound of muted trumpets with clarinet kind of in the middle, helping to put the sounds together. So imagine you're, on shore leave, or you're listening, in the early 40s to your radio station, not your live stream, your, a pandemic live stream in 2020, and here comes this beautiful Moonlight Serenade. I had the pleasure of playing in the Joy Thomas Big Band for a number of years, and I would say we played this song almost every night up at the, Caroga Lake Ballroom, or down at the Crooked Lake, down in Rensselaer County, or at some party for people in tuxedos, or a wedding, or something like that. And as soon as we played this song, the dance floor was just packed with people of all ages who really loved this song and sort of the concept and the state of being about this song, if that makes sense. So just a typical AABA, where the B section takes us to another place. Literally, I can see printed here letter A and letter B. Of course, there's letter C, which is really letter A. And this kind of music was churned out by the hundreds by composers back in the 30s and 40s, seeking to fill radio time, to fill ballroom time, to sort of provide raw material for the giant hungry mouth of the American consumer back when jazz was America's pop music in the 30s and 40s. After World War II, jazz and pop music kind of go in different directions, and we have the sort of dominance of, I would say, singers either working with bands or with small combos or studio orchestras or just pianists or something like that. So singers are really rising to the forefront, and other types of jazz are happening, but they're sort of deep underground, and we think of bebop as an example of this. And we have the rise of bebop happening with musicians in New York City, both in Midtown and up in Harlem, who are experimenting with the chords and the sounds of American pop music, the great songbook that we've been talking about. And because they aren't getting a chance to improvise and take solos and kind of really express themselves, they're this part during the song. Right? You did that for 4 hours a night, or if you were in the trumpet section, you went. You did that kind of stuff, and maybe you got 8 bars of solo every now and then when Doris Day was getting a drink of water or something like that. And so musicians were trying to find a new way to express themselves, and this led to this music called bebop, really developed in the clubs of New York by people like Charlie Parker, the sax player, Lester Young, the tenor sax player, Dizzy Gillespie, the trumpeter, Bud Powell, the pianist, etc. And basically, they wanted music that wasn't for dancing, music that was all about listening and getting a chance to express yourself and take daring solos and show your impressive musicianship and virtuosity. And so they took jazz standards, for example, like I Got Rhythm by George Gershwin. That's the A section, of course. It's an AABA song, like a lot of the songs we're talking about. And they would build their own songs on top of it. And literally, you can go to a club today, if it's open, or remotely, you can email a musician, and say, hey, let's play rhythm changes, or make a Zoom recording and send it to me, or Soundtrap or something, and I'll play my version on top of it because we're not really hanging out anymore. Everybody knows rhythm changes, okay? Basically, it's the harmony of I Got Rhythm without the melody. It turns out that in terms of intellectual property, you can copyright a melody, but you can't copyright a set of harmonic changes, and so performers and composers took advantage of that and kind of lifted the harmony of earlier songs and wrote their own melodies on top. All right, so here's a piece by Sonny Rollins called Oleo, which is based on I Got Rhythm, and it's really in the bebop pocket, and I'll play it as fast as I can and not screw up. But basically, it's an AABA song. All right, let's see. Before I take a solo, how many out there, again, if I was in front of a live crowd, I would say Could you sing this melody? Could you sing Moonlight Serenade? I mean, it's got words that were added, again, by Mitchell Parrish. Do, 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 right? This little melodic fragment that gets tossed around. Well, the melody of Oleo, that's the melody of Oleo, okay? Again, it's not a melody that's designed for the general public to wrap themselves around and say, oh, I love this melody. I mean, you can love this melody, but it's not designed to be loved and consumed in that way. It's designed as a vehicle for virtuoso solos from the bebop band. The horns, the rhythm section, which is kind of more fragmented and not playing the standard patterns. For example, in Moonlight Serenade, I was going... really steady 4 on the floor, dance groove, whereas this is right, not designed for dancing, designed for listening. What the rhythm section is doing is responding to the soloist or the melody and also giving impetus or sort of kicking in the rear end the soloist to kind of make them strive to higher goals and higher excellence. So here comes a solo. Is Oleo by Sonny Rollins. Again, if you can dance to that, you either need to start taking pills or stop taking pills. I'm not quite sure what. Anyway, getting back to some other ideas here, let's see, from my 13-hour concert that I'm excerpting into 1 hour. Let's see. Some songwriters, like Irving Berlin, were pretty much untrained and learned by ear. Other composers had more intense schooling, George Gershwin being one of them, although other people like Ferde Grofé orchestrated his music, not all of it, but orchestrated pieces of it for performance by Paul Whiteman. He wrote music also for the New York Philharmonic, his great piano concerto, all kinds of great pieces. So Gershwin had some serious musical chops. Let's see, Cole Porter is an interesting case because he did not come up through the apprenticeship, little guy in short pants handing out sheet music on the street. He was wealthy, went to Yale, didn't really get into the songwriting game, the musical theater game, until later in his life, in his 30s. And so he's coming at life in a very, very different way. And some of his music goes well beyond the basic expectations of AABA or ABAC or something like that. Under My Skin, I've Got You Under My Skin, that famous Sinatra performance you can think of, goes well beyond that. Night and Day is another one of his great pieces, also in AABA form. The B section takes the basic melody and moves it up to an interesting place. I want to talk about Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein. Jerome Kern, one of the most important early composers of the 20th century, his musical Showboat really set the stage. Again, earlier theatrical performances used the word plot in a really loose way, with an excuse to kind of put songs and actors on stage and put some musicians in the pit. And so Kern really worked on this novel, Showboat by Edna Ferber, and really put together an integrated show where the music was essential to the telling of the story and had great songs like Old Man River, things like that. And so he really thought very deeply about integrating music and theater and things like that. One of his best pieces together with Oscar Hammerstein, before Hammerstein worked with Richard Rodgers, is called All the Things You Are. And it has an intro that got added later on by jazz people. So you can end on a little more modern twist with that ending. Charles Mingus is a bass player who had a very interesting sense of humor and his own take on the world. Of course, his autobiography is called Beneath the Underdog, and he had a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, but he also had this interesting drive that caused him to yell at his band in the middle of gigs, which I find, as a band leader, I find an interesting idea. They would be playing in a club in New York, and he would stop. I don't know if he would actually fire people on the gig, but he would yell at them and make them rehearse and practice, while people are like eating dinner and drinking martinis all around them. He has a version of this piece called All the Things You See Sharp. And he noticed that this intro was the opening of the C-sharp minor prelude by Rachmaninoff. And so he has this crazy version, which you can actually find. I think it's on a recording, Night at the Bohemia, playing at the Bohemia in New York City, where he has this pianist play this song as the intro to All the Things You Are, And in the middle of the piece, you hear various horns. He worked with a sax player and trombonist in his band. And you hear them playing elements of this as a motive of the song, while the piano player, for some reason, throws in little pieces of, what's that piece by Debussy, Clair de Lune. So it's a very interesting piece I recommend you go listen to, because it takes all the things you are and draws all kinds of other relationships to it. I mean, I'm not quite sure if everyone had heard this. Might not have said, oh, what a great bebop lick. It's got great syncopation, it's got tension and drama, and it's unpredictable, unresolved kind of a thing. But Mingus said, oh, let's reference Rachmaninoff. Wouldn't that be a great idea? And it turns out it was a great idea. I want to play one of Mingus's original pieces, which lots of other musicians have added lyrics to, including Joni Mitchell in the early 70s. And this is called Goodbye Pork Pie Hat. It's interesting that some jazz instrumentals seem to be craving lyrics because singers want to sing them. They don't want to just go la 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 la. They want to put actual words to the music. There's this concept called vocalese, where you actually take a solo, a pre-recorded solo by a jazz artist, and add your own lyrics to it. You can think of Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross as great practitioners of this in the 60s, 50s, and 60s. But this is a piece, Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, referencing the death of the great swing player, but with a very cool sound, who really instigated cool jazz, even though he didn't play it himself. He played mostly in a swing idiom. Lester Young, who wore these pork pie hats, and I've seen graphics and pictures from magazines that talk about how Lester Young took a hat off the shelf from somewhere in New York City, and he kind of flattened it down to kind of make that pork pie. I know we don't really eat pork pies anymore, but I'm guessing it's kind of a flat circle thing, and that's kind of what his hats look like. And so, as a tribute to Lester Young, who died a couple months before the recording session where this piece first showed up, it's called Goodbye Pork Pie Hat. I'm not sure how to figure out this piece. Basically, it's 12 bars long. It's bluesy. It's not a blues. It kind of goes to the 4 chord in measure 5, which blues are supposed to have happen, but there are so many harmonic detours in this piece, and it's so rich. It's such a hard piece to solo on because our, jazz musicians practice patterns, and we typically think of these chord series 2-5-1, 2-5-1, 2-5-1, and this doesn't do that. It goes kind of 2-5, oops, jump up a half step. So it's a hard piece to master because of its unique harmonic language, I would say. And sometimes the notes don't match the harmonies, and you get these clashes, but really Mingus was a person who had a lot of grit and clash in his music, and I think the best performances really bring it out. And the number of blue notes in this piece is just astounding. I would say almost every other note, I mean, if I play the very ending, it's just chock full of blue notes, which give it this very mournful, sad piece. It basically says ballad up in the corner, and you can interpret this however you would like, but that's important. Duke Ellington, we can't leave today without talking about Duke Ellington as one of the deans or most important father figures of pop songs in the United States. I don't know how many songs he wrote, over 1,000, I believe. Many of them are in AABA form, and he had his band to kind of work things out. He worked with various other composers, especially his sort of alter ego Billy Strayhorn, who he collaborated with a lot, as well as other lyricists, and just wrote a ton of great, bouncy songs in AABA that sort of really capture the 30s, 40s, 50s. Playing them on the piano doesn't capture the sound of the grit and the wah-wah of the brass mutes, or kind of the very rich vibrato of the sax session, thinking of like Harry Carney on the Barry sax, etc. But his music evolved in a very interesting way from these short pieces from the Cotton Club, where he provided music back in the 20s, to his aspirations to write larger form, almost classical style pieces, and which he did later in his career. Some of these pieces are extracted. For example, Come Sunday is from one of his larger suites. But I don't want to play a slow piece. I have a slow piece written down, but I think I'm going to play in a mellow tone, which is just this great classic mainstream swing groove. So that's kind of this great groovy ABAC piece from Duke Ellington. Again, he wrote a ton and ton and ton of great songs that are sung by great vocalists of all stripes. As our textbook, again, we're using Jazz, second edition by Scott DeVoe and Gary Giddens. Anyone not in the class who wants to run out and pick that up. The most important thing, I think, to think about the Great American Songbook is that the composers of the first half of the 1900s were influenced by jazz players, okay? Gershwin was strongly influenced. I read a story about how when he's putting together Porgy and Bess, he was hanging out with people down in the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina, watching African Americans in their element, putting on music, performing, interacting, etc. And so Gershwin's making notes and thinking about how he's going to turn this into the great Porgy and Bess. And songwriters are being influenced by African Americans in their language, in their music, in rhythm, in all kinds of things that come together, in aspects of culture. And by the same token, jazz players are embracing the interesting songs that come out for musical theater, and they make them their own. I think I'm going to finish with My Favorite Things, which came out on Broadway in 1959, and in 1961, John Coltrane turned it into this amazing modal jazz piece, again, where it's kind of all about the scale that you're playing. It's sort of a piece that really doesn't have a lot of harmony in it. It's like harmony is almost in the background, and Coltrane, who's sort of developing his own brain for music and his own ideas, really loves the vamp qualities, sort of this E minor-ish world, and really just goes to town, also playing the soprano sax, reinventing the sound of the soprano sax. We've been studying earlier sax players, but Coltrane's take on the soprano is super original and really important, and kind of marked a really important starting point. So here's a little bit of My Favorite Things. Again, Richard Rodgers, Oscar Hammerstein from The Sound of Music as interpreted by John Coltrane. I want to thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Again, please join us on this same channel, firstreform.com. In 2 weeks' time, we will have the great Michael Benedict on Vibes to join us for all kinds of interesting music that has the vibes in it. I think we're going to play some Benny Goodman, some Cal Tjader. Of course, we have to play some George Shearing, probably Lionel Hampton. Just a great treat to be working with Mike, and also my usual cohorts, Pete Twigo on bass and Pete Sweeney on the drums, will be on this same stage. Thanks again to Nathan, our sound engineer, for putting this together. If you have any questions, please send me an email at olsent@union.edu. That's olsent@union.edu. Thanks again to First Reformed. Thanks to Union College for their support in putting this together, and we will